So first, I will answer content question number one, which is, why are certain brain regions more susceptible to anoxic brain injury after cardiac arrest? And how might this explain aspects of this patient's cognitive performance? So first, to just kind of give some information, during when someone has a cardiac arrest, the blood flow to their brain pretty much stops, meaning that the appropriate amount of oxygen is also not reaching their brain. So, in the provided article by Fugate 2017, it helped to explain that some neurons have a much higher metabolic demand and more excitatory neurotransmitter activity. So, that makes them more vulnerable and susceptible when they are deprived of oxygen. And the particular regions include the CA1 sector of the hippocampus, the basal ganglia, cerebellar, Purkinje cells, and the neocortex. So the presentation of the patient given by the group mentioned that he had difficulties with memory, spatial reasoning, and executive functioning, which corresponds with the damage that would be in these more susceptible, vulnerable regions, especially the hippocampus and the neocortex. And additionally, when blood flow and oxygen are lost during a cardiac arrest, it's common for neurons to quickly use up their energy that's stored. So excitatory neurotransmitters, including glutamate, cause a harmful rise in intracellular calcium, which then leads to death in cell death in these regions. So overall, the susceptibility of the brain regions help explain the patient's cognitive performance. So the injury to the CA1 region of the hippocampus strongly impacts his severe memory that he currently presents with, and the damage to the neocortical areas um, match the deficits that he presented with in the CLQT results, which include his attention, his language organization, his visual spatial processing, and his executive functioning deficits. Um, and based on the MRI findings that were presented and now known susceptibility in these regions, it helps to explain his poor insight, his disorganized language, his rapid speech, and then his difficulty with planning and problem solving. So, just to kind of recap the areas that are most susceptible to anoxia following cardiac arrest are the ones that the patient currently relies on for his memory, his attention, and his executive functioning. So that kind of helps to explain the severe cognitive impairments that he now presents with. So now I will answer content question number two, which is, how does relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis cause brain damage? And what MS-related changes in this patient's brain are likely causing her cognitive deficits? So first off, relapsing remitting MS causes brain damage through a process of autoimmune inflammation. And this process, just to kind of put it briefly, the immune system attacks the myelin sheath that surrounds axons, which leads to demyelination and slowed neural conduction and axonal loss. The Sacco et al. Article that was provided from 2015 describes that MS also causes widespread white matter atrophy, gray matter atrophy, and hippocampal atrophy, all of which contribute to the cognitive deficits and impairments. The group presentation also mentioned this, noting that MS-related cognitive issues often arise even though her MRI didn't show extensive lesions, but because there's still deeper regional brain atrophy, that will contribute to her cognitive deficits. Sacco et al. Also discussed that white matter damage plays the largest role in cognitive impairment in RRMS. White matter damage can lead to deficits in processing speed, attention, executive functioning, and then visual spatial memory. And the white matter lesions disrupt the kind of pathways of communication between different cortical regions. So information doesn't move as quickly or as efficiently between different networks in the brain that are required for attention and memory and other cognitive tasks. The article also found that hippocampal atrophy is common in RRMS, and specifically left hippocampal atrophy um, correlates or contributes to verbal memory deficits. And this kind of helps to explain why this patient and other MS patients often have difficulty with recalling recent events, or creating new memories and holding on to different information. And the the group presentation described that the patient has deficits with her attention, her short-term and working memory, reading comprehension, organization, and executive functioning. And these specific domains are linked to the white matter atrophy that was discussed in the article. Her difficulties with multitasking and managing um, different complex situations or instructions um, is correlates with the um, slower processing that she now has due to the disruptions that are happening in the white matter tracks. And her other deficits in her memory, like um, losing track of her thoughts or misplacing different items or recalling events that have happened, align with the hippocampal involvement that the article discussed. Um, so kind of just in summary, our MS causes brain damage through demyelination, axonal injury, and progressive atrophy of white and gray matter tracks. And in this patient, her deficits are explained best or most significantly by the white matter atrophy and the likely hippocampal involvement. Now I will answer content question number 9, which is, although typical Alzheimer's disease or AD and logopenic variant PPA are both caused by underlying AD pathology, they present differently. Where does neurodegeneration usually start in each, and how does this explain initial differences in their behavioral presentation? So first, in typical Alzheimer's disease, neurodegeneration begins in the hippocampal interrenal region, which is the focus of early Braak stage pathology. In the article that was provided by Mesolum et al. In 2014, it explains that this region is typically the earliest and often the most severely affected region in typical AD. And this site is critical for forming new memories and working to integrate information. And because of this early on middle temporal involvement, it's typical for episodic memory to be the most highlighted or key symptom and earliest symptom of typical AD. And in the logopenic variant of primary progressive aphasia, even though the underlying pathology is often AD, the starting point of neurodegeneration is different. LVPPA shows early asymmetric atrophy in the left posterior superior temporal gyrus and the left temporal parietal junction. And this was also discussed in the group presentation in the article that degeneration um, is typically in the left posterior temporal parietal region. And these regions are critical for phonological working memory and sentence repetition and lexical retrieval. So because of this difference in the point of neurodegeneration, LVPPA does not begin with memory loss, and instead the earliest symptoms that are commonly noticed are more word finding difficulties, difficulties with repetition, and then speech can be more slowed or halted while a person's grammar and single word comprehension are relatively preserved. So just to kind of recap, typical AD um, typically presents first with memory deficits, while LVPPA has language first deficits. So just some examples of um, behavioral differences that you might notice between the two. In typical AD, the earliest, the more early hippocampal involvement um, disrupts the encoding and the storage of new episodic memories. So people might begin to notice that someone is repeating their questions more often or more forgetful or just generally are more disoriented, while in LVPPA, the early on posterior temporal parietal neurodegeneration disrupts um, the phonology. So someone might present with difficulties with retrieving or finding their words. Um, they might have more pauses within their speech, difficulties with repetition, and then um, more difficulty with their working memory to that supports their overall language. So just to kind of sum up the distinct or different parts of neurodegeneration in each of these help to kind of explain why these two present so differently, even though they are both driven by AD pathology. I chose scenario question number two. So the first one for this was, what would I do with this patient during treatment to help him improve self-awareness regarding his deficits and why? So to improve this patient's self-awareness, I would want to target using metacognitive strategy training. And a specific example I thought to use with him would be prediction, performance, and reflection cycles. So before completing any task, such as an attention task or um, maybe scheduling different tasks or organizing different information, I would ask him to predict how he thinks he's going to perform on the task. And then we would perform the task and I would just kind of let him perform how he would naturally and independently. And then following the task, I would have us reflect and kind of compare the prediction to his actual performance and kind of reflect on maybe what was different and what was a little bit um, more difficult. And I think this would help him to kind of recognize maybe patterns in his functioning without pointing them out directly to him. It kind of lets him see see his own performance rather than just having them being pointed out to him all the time from somebody else. Um, I think it would also be helpful to use videos within sessions to kind of record and then review errors with him so that he can, again, kind of recognize his errors on his own or notice when he makes mistakes within a task, um, to kind of, again, make that more concrete for him to see rather than someone just telling that to him. And I would also want to focus on self-monitoring tasks. So having him just kind of like note down or take tallies even of moments that he recognizes when that he is making an error, making a mistake, or maybe noticing when something is a little bit more difficult or different for him than he expected it to be. And again, that's just to kind of build that self-awareness internally, um, and just help target those attention difficulties or any executive functioning difficulties that he may be having. And throughout his treatment, I would definitely want to make sure that I was asking questions throughout the tasks that are kind of framed in a way that we're working together. So asking maybe where things felt difficult or working together to decide what might be beneficial for him to use next time. Um, and that would just primarily to promote his insight to his deficits even a little bit more. And so overall, I think that the metacognitive strategy training and the kind of self-reflection and self-monitoring could be the most helpful ways for him to address his lack of insight to his deficits and without pointing things out to him constantly and kind of having him be more aware of those things on his own. Now I will answer the second question in scenario number two, which is as he begins to become more aware of his deficits, he starts to endorse more feelings of hopelessness and depression during your sessions. Describe your response to this comment and your general approach to integrating counseling in this patient's cognitive rehabilitation and overall TBI recovery. So, the first thing that I would want to make sure to do is to validate his feelings and acknowledge that these feelings make sense and are common as he starts to gain more insight and be aware of what kind of deficits and impact that his TBI has had on him. Um, I think I would want to say along the lines of how it's understandable that these feelings can be scary or overwhelming, and that it's common for people to experience this following a TBI after they start to gain more insight and more information about what has changed after their injury. But also definitely emphasizing that this doesn't mean that something is wrong with the patient, but that it's a step in the right direction. Um, that this it's the first kind of step to be aware of what his deficits now are, and then that working on those deficits now that he is more aware of them. And that can be something that we focus on and work on together in our sessions. So I would want to, again, just kind of reframe his thinking um, and kind of put a positive spin on it appropriately. Again, making sure to validate his feelings um, and emphasize that now that he is more aware of his deficits, that we can kind of use different strategies to target his areas of difficulty and that he can now have a little bit more independence even in these strategies because he is more aware of what's going on. And I would also want to make sure to highlight and make sure he's able to see what kind of progress and gains that he's able and has been making. Um, I think it would also be just important to focus on within sessions the just some coping mechanisms or strategies, um, to bring some counseling into the sessions. So helping him discuss maybe his fears or um, making sure to point out what his strengths are, helping him point out his strengths, and then working together to make a set of goals while being realistic about those goals and being very clear and upfront with him about what we're seeing together and create goals that work well for him. And in the question also mentioned that his partner and his parents often join him in session. So having conversations with them would also be beneficial to kind of help them understand more about how they can support him in this and um, recognize and validate his emotions. And then again, just pointing out his strengths and reflecting on that with him. And I think it would be important if these intense feelings and emotions do persist. I would want to explain to him that mood changes and different kinds of emotions and being able to process those emotions that come with an injury and a TBI, it is not a bad thing to need a referral to a mental health professional to just kind of gain some more strategies and tools to help him cope with all of those feelings that he's experiencing. So then I would want to make sure to just work alongside his medical team and potentially a mental health professional just to kind of make sure that he is getting referrals and care that he needs. Um, so throughout our sessions, I would just want to make sure that we were focusing on recovery. I would want to be compassionate and empathetic, validate his feelings, and really emphasize that it's really a good thing that he's more um, aware of his deficits and changes now following his TBI, and maybe emphasize that it is another starting point for more growth, and that is something that we can work on within our therapy sessions.